I'm doing it.
Did Sophie Pecora disappear after America's Got Talent? For viewers who remember a 15-year-old Sophie standing on the AGT stage in 2019, it might seem that way. She received Brad Paisley's Golden Buzzer, earned standing ovations, and suddenly became one of the young performers people were watching closely. But then the television spotlight moved on. Sophie didn't become a regular fixture on mainstream TV, and for many casual AGT viewers, the story simply stopped there. But that isn't where Sophie Pecora's story ended. In fact, the latest evidence from 2026 tells a very different story. Sophie has continued releasing original music, including The Quiet Kid in February and Poker Face in July 2026. Her catalog has continued growing through 2024, 2025, and 2026, while Spotify currently lists tens of thousands of monthly listeners. So the real question isn't what happened to Sophie after AGT. The more interesting question is why so many people stopped seeing the work she continued doing after the show. And to understand that, we have to go back to the moment when her television breakthrough suddenly took an unexpected turn. Sophie Pecora's AGT story had almost everything a young contestant could want. At just 15 years old, she performed her original song, Misfits, during the judge cuts, and guest judge Brad Paisley was impressed enough to press the golden buzzer. That decision sent Sophie directly into the live quarterfinals. It looked like the beginning of a major television journey. Her songwriting stood out because she wasn't simply performing a familiar cover. She was presenting original material based on her own perspective and experiences. Then came the live stage at the Dolby Theater. Sophie performed another original song, Happy in LA, and the judges gave her standing ovations. But the result was not the fairytale ending many viewers may have expected. Sophie landed among the acts in the lower voting group, alongside Ansley Burns and the Emerald Bells, and faced the Duncan Save. America ultimately chose Ansley Burns, meaning Sophie was eliminated from the competition. That moment is important because it explains the first major misconception about her career. Sophie didn't leave AGT as a finalist or winner. Her golden buzzer created enormous attention, but it did not automatically create a mainstream music career. For a teenager, that could have been the end of the story. Instead, Sophie took a different route. What happened next is where the story becomes much more interesting. Rather than treating AGT as the final destination, Sophie continued developing as a songwriter. Her official biography describes songwriting as a central part of her identity, and her catalog expanded with projects such as the Wildflower EP, Raise the Bar, and singles including Overthinking, Keeping Everything Inside, Anxiety, Extrovert, and Perfectionist. Her song, Anxiety, also received major recognition through the unsigned only music competition, while Seventh Grade had previously won first place in the teen category of the International Songwriting Competition. That matters because it shows that AGT was not the only source of validation for her music. She continued building an identity outside the television show. And there was another important shift happening at the same time. The teenage performer audiences remembered from AGT was getting older. Her writing was evolving with her. Instead of depending entirely on the emotional impact of one television appearance, she was building a catalog that could exist independently of the show. That is a much slower path to recognition, but it can also be more sustainable. The problem is that it doesn't create the same headlines as a golden buzzer. There is no dramatic television moment every time an artist releases a single. So while Sophie was still working, many casual viewers simply stopped hearing about her. But the music itself tells a different story. By the time Sophie entered the 2023 and 2024 period, the direction of her music was becoming even clearer. Her catalog expanded with releases including Extrovert and Perfectionist in 2023, followed by In a Perfect World, Mood Swings, Battlefield, Crime Scene, and the EP The Youth in 2024. That is not the release pattern of someone who quietly walked away from music. It is the opposite. She was continuing to experiment with themes, sounds, and songwriting while moving further away from the identity of the young contestant audiences remembered. Even the titles tell part of the story. Crime Scene, Vampire, Mood Swings, and The Youth belong to a different artistic period than the songs that first introduced her on AGT. Sophie was no longer simply the teenager with a guitar who surprised the judges. She was becoming an independent artist with a growing body of work. There is also an important reality that needs to be acknowledged. Her career did not suddenly turn into mainstream superstardom. There is no credible evidence that she became a major pop celebrity after AGT. But that doesn't mean nothing happened. It means the path was quieter than television fame. She continued releasing music, building an audience, and developing her own creative identity. That distinction is important because online stories often force artists into two categories: huge success or complete disappearance. Sophie Pecora fits neither. She continued working, and by 2025 that work was still moving forward. Then came another series of releases that made it harder to argue that Sophie had simply faded away. Her 2025 catalog included Aliens and Brainless, continuing a pattern that had already been established the previous year. Again, there was no major television comeback attached to these releases. No golden buzzer, no primetime judging panel, no giant reality show storyline, just new music. And that is exactly why her post-act career is easy to misunderstand. Television creates visible milestones. Independent music creates quieter ones. A contestant can become famous in a single night because millions of people watch the same performance. But when that same artist releases music independently, the audience is fragmented across streaming platforms, social media, and individual fan communities. The career continues, but it becomes much less visible to casual viewers. Sophie appears to have followed that second path. Her official and streaming profiles show an artist who continues to write and release material rather than relying only on songs from her AGT era. Spotify currently lists roughly 62,800 monthly listeners, which is a meaningful audience but also evidence that she is operating on a very different scale from mainstream pop superstars. That number should not be exaggerated. It doesn't mean Sophie has become a global superstar. But it does make one thing clear: the music is still reaching listeners. And then, in 2026, something happened that made her current chapter even more interesting. On February 13, 2026, Sophie released a new single called "The Quiet Kid." The title immediately catches attention because of how closely it connects with the identity many viewers associated with her early career. Sophie first became widely known as a young performer whose quiet, personal songwriting stood in contrast to the huge AGT stage around her. Years later, "The Quiet Kid" arrived as a new piece of music from an older Sophie. Apple Music and Amazon Music both list the release on February 13, 2026, while Sophie's official website features the song alongside her other recent work. That doesn't prove the title was intended as a direct statement about her AGT past, and it would be irresponsible to claim that without Sophie saying so herself. But as a piece of storytelling, the timing is striking. The girl audiences once knew as the quiet young songwriter is no longer frozen at 15 years old. She has continued growing, writing, and releasing music into adulthood. And the evolution becomes even clearer when we look at what happened only a few months later. Because "The Quiet Kid" was not the end of her 2026 releases. It was only part of the story. On July 24, 2026, Sophie Pecora released another single, "Poker Face." Apple Music lists it as her latest release, while Spotify records the single under Pecora Productions with a runtime of 2 minutes and 38 seconds. That date matters because it gives us something concrete to point to when discussing Sophie in 2026. She isn't simply recycling her old AGT performances. She is still putting out new material. And that changes the answer to the question: what happened after America's Got Talent? The simplest answer is that Sophie continued being an artist, but she did it largely outside the weekly television cycle that first made her recognizable. Her recent catalog includes releases from 2024, 2025, and 2026, showing a consistent pattern rather than one isolated comeback. This is also where viewers need to separate nostalgia from reality. Sophie has not returned in 2026 as a huge mainstream celebrity dominating the charts. There is no reason to manufacture that narrative. Her current position is more modest and, in some ways, more interesting. She is an independent artist continuing to release music while maintaining an audience that can find her through streaming and social platforms. For someone who first became known through a television competition, that's a very different kind of career. And it may explain why people who only remember her AGT audition believe she disappeared. The real story of Sophie Pecora in 2026 is therefore not a dramatic disappearance, and it isn't a massive Hollywood comeback either. It's something in between. Sophie became known nationally as a teenager after Brad Paisley's golden buzzer sent her to the AGT quarterfinals, but her run ended there when she failed to advance through the Duncan save. Afterward, she continued releasing original music and gradually moved into a different stage of her artistic life. Her catalog expanded through 2023 and 2024, continued with new releases in 2025, and reached 2026 with The Quiet Kid and Poker Face. Her current streaming audience shows that people are still listening, even if she isn't receiving the same television exposure that made her famous in the first place. And perhaps that is the part of her story that deserves more attention. America's Got Talent gave Sophie a moment. But the years afterward reveal whether an artist can create something beyond that moment. In Sophie's case, the answer appears to be yes. She didn't win the season. She didn't become an overnight pop superstar. She didn't remain permanently in the spotlight. Instead, she kept writing. She kept releasing music. And she kept moving forward. That may not be the most sensational version of the story, but it is the one supported by the evidence. Sometimes an artist's biggest development happens after the television cameras stop rolling. And for Sophie Pecora, 2026 suggests that the AGT chapter may have been only the beginning of a much longer musical journey.